Hey y'all, welcome back to Rope Trotting, where today we are excited to be joined by two awesome people who are living here in Copenhagen with us. We have Adrian Mackinder, originally from the UK, Annie Samples, originally from the US, and today we're going to talk about the differences between schooling in our homelands, the UK and the US, and now in Denmark. So maybe to start with you, Adrian, what has been your experience growing up? What would you say is the classic hallmarks of a UK education?
I should say as a caveat, I went to a private school.
Fair.
And a very old school, so I basically went to Hogwarts, but no wizards. The classic hallmarks of an education when I was there it was the basics of, it was the reading, writing, arithmetic. There was very little pastoral care. It was about academic excellence, starting school at 4. The age of 4, which I think is a crucial difference we might come on to later.
Yeah.
So it's being at school from the age of 4 till 18, and then going off to university. Most people are done and dusted by university by 21, out into the world.
Wow.
And how about you, Annie? So growing up in the US,
Yeah.
kind of what was your experience?
I did not go to a private school, but I did go to a public school. And I would say the big focus there was actually on standardized testing. I felt like that was such a core part of my education all the way until graduating high school. And so the grade system in and of itself is so different compared to the UK, compared to Denmark. The way the schools are split up was so interesting. I had that very classic American high school situation.
Now, Adrian, you have two younger children that are going through the Danish system now. What do you find are some of the main differences between their education and what you had at their same ages? They're what, roughly 8 and 5?
They're 8 and 5.
Yeah.
The biggest challenge was actually the age when you start school here.
Yeah.
And I find it more challenging when I speak to my friends back home, because you said you start school at 4. So my son started at 7. So I find it very odd that he's only just learning to read and count and spell, and yet he's 8 next month. And I do find that interesting when he might be playing a video game or something that's, and it's like, well, he can't really play it on his own because I need to be able to read what's on the screen for him. Whereas I look at the comparison is I'd already been reading for 3 years, and writing and doing those things. I'm not saying I was churning out novels.
Sure.
But by the same token, I find that an odd one. And it's not saying that the way Danes do it is wrong. It's just that's the culture clash that I find a bit of a challenge. The other thing is the schools here, they get the parents are much more actively involved. My son goes to a small school, far end of Østerbro, and I find it very strange they keep asking us to do things for the school. Help out, and they do certain things. And it's like, oh, really? There are days where the parents come in and do a day as teachers.
Yeah. I just did that. I always sign up. Why do I do that? It's horrible. It's so overstimulating, and I don't speak Danish so well. But now the kids are finally starting to speak English. My kids are 9, 7, and then I've got a 5-year-old as well and a 1-year-old. Yeah, what a thing.
It makes a difference, doesn't it?
It's so interesting because you're saying you feel like there's so much parent involvement here, whereas, funding in the U.S. for the schools is so horrible. The parents are doing even more. There's a whole parent-teachers association, and they're basically running the whole school. So I've been like, this is so relaxing compared to.
So I guess it's all relative, isn't it? It's what because my school, because I think it was well funded, because it was a private school. Yeah. It was very much, and also the age I'm at, it was very much you just dropped your kids off at school and said bye-bye.
Yeah.
Right.
And we'll see you at the end of the day. And we may or may not ask you how your day was.
Yeah.
And so I think that was the interesting tension. But sometimes I feel like, why am I and it's all this is when I feel very British. I'm like, isn't this your job?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Aren't you being paid to do this? Being paid quite well to do this. I'm not saying that I don't agree with the principle of us being involved, but I've got a job to
cozy.
do.
Yeah.
That's the other thing. I've got stuff to do. I can't take a day off work.
But then going back to what you were saying about the reading, it's also based so much on the kid's personal preference, right? And just what they feel like doing. So my oldest son was quite determined to read at I would say 3-4 years old, and he just taught himself.
Right.
So then we moved here when he was end of 4 or 5. He was already reading. And, instead of that being kind of a praise thing, the response that we got from teachers was oh, what's wrong? What's wrong with him? Or what did you do? It was almost like an accusatory, like.
Really?
Did you make him?
Yeah, did you make him? Did you force him to do this? And I was like, no, I promise we didn't make him read,
And that's a very good point. It is the personal preference.
Yeah,
sure.
My son doesn't have any particular interest in
Exactly.
reading, I think. He likes stories, he likes storytelling, he's conceptual, but he's not particularly interested in reading. I think my daughter is reading to us even though she can't read.
Yeah.
She's only
like,
4,
let's
but
go.
she's like telling us what's in the book.
Right.
So I think she will probably take to it a little bit.
Totally.
you know.
Yeah. My second son wasn't quite as interested in learning to read, and he's on the typical Danish track. And I just don't really bring that topic up with my American friends because there's so much emphasis placed on reading acquisition by 4 or 5 years old in the U.S., which sounds like it's kind of similar.
It's exactly the same.
Yeah,
and I
yeah.
think you're right to not bring it up because
Yeah.
it just makes me feel a little bit, not that I should, I just can't help the fact that I'm from one culture and I hear my
Sure.
friends talk
Yeah.
about their kids who are doing X and Y at this age, and it's like, my son is still doing ABC. And they're
But it's,
already,
but it's a completely different world, and so
Yeah.
it's almost impossible to compare.
Yeah.
And Annie, your oldest, did he start school in the U.S.?
He did not. So he was
Okay.
going to like a little preschool program
Got
maybe
it.
2 days a week. So he started 0 class. They're at a Danish school as well, speaking Danish and everything. So yeah, if anybody at home has a problem with the fact that my kids don't read, I'm like, well, do your kids also speak and read in Danish? You
Right.
know, like
I have bilingual kids,
Exactly.
like, give me-
it's
give me
okay.
that.
The experience in and of itself of moving and everything, I feel like it's been such a supplemental experience, and not that even that is necessary for kids who are Danish. You know what I'm saying? Maybe they aren't quite bilingual yet,
but that's a challenge, and that also goes down to the personalities, because another thing we found is my son, for no reason at all, born and raised in Denmark, decided to lean into English. That's his emotional language, to the extent that it was fine when he was at Burnerhound. When he went into school, it suddenly became problematic because there were no other international kids in his class because it's so small. So he suddenly realized his Danish is not up to speed with his peers.
Yeah.
And so his confidence suffered from that, and he challenged that. My daughter, again, because she's a different human being, just flits effortlessly between the two and is actually more Danish than English. So she'll speak more Danish at home.
Yeah.
I know that this is my son's emotional language is English, because when he's not with us or talking to his sister, he will never communicate in Danish just when he's talking to his sister. And he said he feels more comfortable speaking in English.
And your partner is Danish?
She's Danish.
Okay, that's so interesting.
So that is,
that's such a whole different factor as well.
I think it might have been because we speak English at home.
Yeah.
And to these, my wife said to me, she said, I find it very weird if we started communicating in Danish, because that's English is our relationship language, because we met in England.
Wow.
And we lived in England together before we moved over. So she said it would be odd if we started speaking Danish, because that's not the you I fell in love with.
Oh,
I was like, well,
it's
that's a very nice way.
personality.
Yeah. It's also a nice way of getting me off the hook.
Yeah,
Right.
you're like, oh,
Right.
yes, honey, of course.
But
yes.
so I think that might have been why him growing up in that environment,
Yeah.
English was he watched just as much English TV, probably more than Danish TV.
Yeah.
And then watches Ramachang and stuff. But he gravitated towards stuff in English. That was just how he's finding his path.
Cool. And it's going okay with his education
It's
and
getting
everything?
better.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was a challenge.
Yeah.
But you can just see, it's like, you hear about people that moved to a country age 10 who didn't speak the language, but then they just learned to swim.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
And his Danish. All his friends at school are Danish, and so he speaks. He always understood everything because he was born and raised here.
Yeah.
So it's much better now. But it was an interesting challenge that we didn't see coming. We actually had a speech therapist assess him, and that was the point when the speech therapist turned to me and said, "Adrian, your son isn't bilingual; he's English."
Oh, wow. That's
And it
so
was like,
interesting.
really?
Yeah.
To be born and raised in this country and yet still not, because it's so.
That's cool, though.
So, it is cool. So he was like, the Danish was coming at the English from the side and knocking it all off a bit.
Wow.
Yeah.
But we just didn't see that coming.
That's
Wow,
fascinating.
That is.
And I'm curious, you talked about how like the school worked with you and to go through it that way. I guess Annie as well. I mean, obviously your kid, you only speak English at home,
Yeah,
obviously.
exactly.
With, all 6 of you only speak English.
Correct.
How has that been? How have the Danish schools reacted to having you be a 100% English family? Adrian, you have your wife who speaks Danish, is from the system here. You guys
Yeah.
have 0.
Yeah.
How has that been working with the schools here in Denmark,
Yeah.
acclimating to you as much as you acclimating to it?
Yeah, and that is actually like my biggest motivation for learning Danish, is because obviously they operate everything in Danish, despite the fact that they're meant to be learning English by like 2nd class. What's funny is that Danish is such a complex language, and you're talking about this is this kid's emotional language and having different personalities in each language. I am learning Danish and I'm excited about it and I'm motivated to do it, but like to be able to convey myself properly in Danish, I can't picture that yet. I'm open to it, obviously, but I do get a lot of comments from teachers being like, "Oh, you still haven't learned Danish," because my oldest son has been in the school 3 almost 4 years, and they're like, "Oh, we can't take this meeting in Danish." I'm like, well, you can, but maybe I won't catch everything, and maybe it's just. It is complex, and I'm very humbled by it.
I can imagine.
Yeah,
I think the schools have a certain mindset where they they tend to advocate, well, we will all be in Danish.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And sometimes it can be counterintuitive because it's like, okay, I get the principle you're trying to push across here, but we're also in a room talking about my child's well-being and welfare. I would like it if if one parent isn't excluded.
Yeah,
Mm.
It's just like, please, we'll meet each other halfway. Let's do English and Danish in a meeting so we can all
perfect.
because then everyone is included. Because as I said to you earlier, I guarantee your English will be better than my Danish.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I never push for things. Like, can we have it in English? I'll say, is it okay if we do both?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And sometimes they're more agreeable to that than
That's
others.
cute.
And I find that a bit of a challenge because it is also 2023 and we're in a capital city in Northern Europe.
Yeah.
It's not like I'm asking them to do it in Danish and Urdu.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's sometimes the resistance I've met can be surprising.
Yeah.
Mm.
I think it's sometimes a case of put your egos aside. It's not about
Sure.
us. It's about what's best.
For
our kids.
That's so valid. Well, it just depends which teacher you're talking to, because some of them get really excited about the opportunity to speak English, and they're like, yeah, let's try it. But yeah, I prefer a nice mix because I'm learning too, and so I want to learn all the different words for these, challenges, whatever it is that we're facing.
I'd like to kind of do a little thought experiment with you guys as well.
Oh, okay.
So if your kids, so in your case, Adrian, let's say your kids were growing up in London, how would their experience be different, and vice versa? If you happen to be the kid growing up in Copenhagen, how would your experience have been different? What are maybe the flip-flops between their childhood, your childhood, that would have been different between you guys?
Well, I think that there would have been surprise so we'd flipped over. I think it would be surprising how little sort of it may have changed. I mean, I went to school a long time ago.
Sure, also.
But in my day, be like, okay, well, where's this is surprising. There's no emphasis. All the emphasis in English schools is on academic ability, as opposed to, say, the more pastoral things like being kind, being a good citizen, that kind of thing. It's definitely, in my day, was not something that was emphasized as much, to the detriment of a child's well-being.
Yeah.
I look back at my time there, and I had a good time at school. I enjoyed it, but I'm very aware of its shortcomings looking back. And my school was an exam factory.
Oh,
and
sure.
It was all about bum, bum, bum. They didn't really care how you were feeling and whether you were going under.
Right.
You were trying to cram for your exams. So I think that they would be surprised. Why aren't they just playing more? Why aren't they? That would be the thought experiment. Why aren't they teaching each other just to get on with each other and be kind and tolerant and accepting?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that might be the big contrast, that if I was moving over to the UK as a non-Brit.
There's a certain value in that, because adult life isn't a whole bunch of exams. It honestly is, how do you function in a society, being kind or figuring things out or interacting, and that's the value of
academia
learning.
Is a bubble. Having
it's
been in
own
academia
thing.
in my past, it's its own little world, and it's not real life. I mean, just take simple level. When I was at school, I learnt quadratic equations and algebra, right? I would have really liked to have learnt accounts and bookkeeping.
Sure.
Being self-employed. That's more useful, just to know how to manage one's accounts.
Yeah, to have
more useful.
Yeah, to have some usefulness, and then also what you're saying about learning to get on with one another. I didn't do so well in school, but at the beginning of my academic career, I guess, I was established to be in this gifted and talented program, but because there was no teaching how to just have a normal life, how to get along with others, I was kind of a nerd, and so I got picked on a lot, and then the impact that had on my self-confidence, on my social status, that became my main focus instead of my education, instead of my future. And, my 20s, it was a struggle. It took me a long time to figure out what it is that I wanted to do. And I don't see Danish kids really going through that. Maybe they take a really fun gap year and then they get right down to it. They've got a pretty clear idea of the person that they are and the sort of future that they want to have. And I think that is such a huge gift. So yeah, maybe they're not learning to read until they're 7, but they're also not having to grapple with all of these complex social issues alone, and that's so cool.
That's a really good
Yeah,
point because
yeah.
you've got your whole life to learn to read and write, right?
Right,
Yeah,
And it's like,
exactly.
but
No
those
pressure.
things that are important, like the emotional well-being
Yeah.
and confidence, self-esteem. All those things are so important. I mean, it's like just a quick example of how sort of out of touch my school was. I had a good time. I went to an all-boys school,
Oh,
right?
wow.
Which there is no argument I can hear from our single-sex schools, yet they still exist. There's no argument
Yeah,
that justifies it. But what was interesting is that it basically created the boys into two tribes, which was basically if you were a kind of nerdy, self-conscious, shy boy, you were scared of girls, and if you were a confident jock, you objectified them.
Right.
Perfect.
And there was nothing in between.
No.
So which one of these
Which
camps
camp
do
are
you
you
wanna
in?
be
Yeah,
Oh.
yeah.
You know,
Oh,
because
that's
they were
tricky.
seen as an other alien species from the school down the road.
Yeah.
It's like what there is no benefit for life for that
No.
having that as your upbringing.
Ugh,
But that's
scary.
so I'm glad that my children do not have that.
Yeah, yeah.
No.
Yeah.
I think if my kids were still in the U.S., my plan, and this was kind of a big hurdle for me moving over here, is because I was so committed to this, because of the safety factor and just the education. We were in Portland, Oregon, and it is a not very well ranked education system. But my intention was to homeschool them as
Really?
long as I could, and using like supplemental education, using resources like museums and other teachers offer classes on top of it. So it wouldn't have just been me, but it's really interesting to consider. Like, I was planning to have all of these kids home all the time, not all the time, but a big chunk of the time, being really heavy-handed in their education, and now going to they're just in school all the time. I don't know what's going on most of the time because of the language barrier. You know
Sure.
what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So
I feel
it's
that.
been a really transformative experience, but a really nice exercise in just being humbled and figuring out how to get outside of your comfort zone, for sure.
I'm glad you brought that up. And I think one other thing that's great to bring up is the other side of education, which is graduation, which comes at the end. And if you click on this video right here, you'll see when we talked about what it's like having a graduation here in Denmark. Thanks for watching, everyone. Hi.